Welcome to the channel. We're going to be looking at the Razer Edge Wi-Fi handheld one more time. It has received a price drop recently. Originally the list price was around $400. You can get them several retailers from anywhere from $200 to $250. Right now there's as I'm recording this video, there's a deal on Newegg where you can get one of these for $200 brand new. So it's certainly worthwhile looking at this handheld, looking at its capabilities, and seeing how it competes at this lower price with some of the other retro handheld options. So let's dive in. So, looking at specifications, the Razer Edge, as long as it's at the $200 price point instead of the $400 price point, comes in with pretty impressive specifications. Top of the list, we have a 6.8-inch 2400 by 1080 screen, which is actually capable of 144 Hz refresh rate, although for retro gaming you can actually lower the refresh rate so you don't have to run it that speed all the time. But it certainly does make for a pretty good experience if you're scrolling web pages and things like that. It is a 20:9 aspect ratio though, so maybe not ideal for retro gaming, but it's actually a pretty large screen as it is, so you get a fair amount of space even if you have your black bars. And being an OLED screen, the black bars are actually black, so if you're playing in a dark room, you don't have the unused part of the screen acting like a giant light and being distracting. Comes with Android 12, which is, of course, not the latest, but one thing about Android 12 is at least it's better for streaming than Android 13 is. A lot of people with Android 13 handhelds are seeing some problems with, stuttering and latency in streaming. Apparently, it's not an issue on Android 12. So, not the newest operating system, but not bad, and it is still receiving security updates as of June. So, for Android 12, it is fairly up to date. Of course, we have a Snapdragon G3X Gen 1, which is essentially a relabeled Snapdragon 888 Plus, which is pretty good for retro gaming. It can handle most PlayStation 2 games upscaled. It is, in terms of comparisons to other retro handhelds, it is significantly more powerful than offerings like the T820 based RG Cube and RG556. There is a big difference between those and this handheld in power, and it's actually a little more powerful than the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, which comes in, at least based on the sale price, at about the same price point as this. So if you were looking for something on the level of the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, but you hated the screen because the screen on the Retroid Pocket 4 series is not very good, then maybe this is an option. Now, you can get video out of this thing. It's via the USB-C port on the tablet itself, but if you're going to do video out on this, you're going to need to take the tablet out of the controller because the full features of the USB-C port are on the tablet itself and are not passed through to the controller. Now, speaking of the controller, there actually is a standard headphone jack where you can plug in a set of wired headphones. It's actually built into the controller, but the tablet itself doesn't have one. So if you want to use headphones, you need to make sure the controller's hooked up. Now, the Razer Edge is fairly wide with the controller attached, which you might think, oh, well, it's huge, it's not very portable. But since you can take it apart, it's actually surprisingly more portable than you would think. But the dimensions here, about 10 inches wide with the controller on at its widest point, about 3 3/8 inch in this dimension right here, and the tallness, and about 1.25 inches thick. Again, with the controller attached, it is obviously much thinner if you don't have the controller on. And that actually is an option. You can certainly take this thing around without the controller, and I've been actually doing that. I just leave the controller at home if I don't need it, and just slip it into a PlayStation Vita sleeve, and it's perfectly pocketable. So that's it for the specifications. Let's take a look around the handheld and talk about build quality and things like that. So, in terms of the build quality of the Razer Edge, remember this was actually meant to be a $400 handheld. So, the build quality is actually really good. It's got a probably one of the best screens that I've seen for a handheld gaming device. Admittedly, I haven't seen some of the more expensive offerings from Ioneo, but this is very good. The screen is actually a lot easier to look at than the screen on the Odin 2 Pro. It is certainly way better than the screen you can get on any Retroid. And also, this pretty much blows Anbernic's offerings, except for maybe the RG556 out of the water. And I think I would actually put this as better than the RG556, because of the refresh rate, if nothing else. And I think the colors, at least from my observations, are a little more accurate here. This also supports HDR. So if you're watching HDR videos on YouTube, not just gaming, this looks really good. Now, in terms of quality itself, of course, this is actually a detachable controller. So you've got the tablet itself, which has your volume buttons and your power. You've got microphones on the top and bottom. You actually even have a camera here. So you can actually use camera compatible games with at least PlayStation Portable emulation. But anything you need a camera for, it actually does have a camera on the front. It doesn't have one on the back, but you have speakers left and right. Oops, not playing a game just yet. We have speakers left and right, and they actually sound pretty good. They have the THX spatial sound, so the bass is not all that great, as you might expect for speakers that are in compartments like this, but certainly this is one of the better sounding handhelds you might use for retro game emulation. So in terms of the tablet itself, it seems to be pretty sturdily built. It's got a plastic back. There are air vents here for the fan, and notice there's no headphone jack on the tablet itself. There is a full-featured USB-C port, but if you want headphones, you need to use the controller. So in terms of the controller itself, you can actually use this on your phone if you like. This is a Kishi Pro V2, and this is actually a very, very nice controller. This is nicer than the built-ins on most of the retro handhelds I've tested. And to hook it up, it's pretty simple. Just that in there, slide it, put it back on, and you're good to go. The controller will actually tell you if it's attached. Now, in terms of the build of the controller itself, the controller has nice clicky buttons. I don't want to actually start too much right now, but you have nice clicky micro switch buttons here. You have programmable buttons. This brings up Razer's little application, but you can actually set it to do whatever you want to without too much trouble. You got your start and select here. You got a screenshot button if you want to take a screenshot during gameplay. There are two programmable macro buttons here. You can pretty much set to whatever other button you want. You have little clicky left and right shoulder buttons, and you have analog triggers. So in terms of the feel in the hand, it actually feels very comfortable to use this thing. I've gotten to actually enjoy playing some PlayStation 2 games with this, and it has got a nice feel in the hands. There actually is some grippy plastic texture on the back here. People like this controller aside from the Razer Edge, and I can see why. It's nice to hold. It's got some grip here, and the buttons are conveniently placed, and the face buttons here are pretty responsive. They have some tactile feedback when you press them, and they don't require a whole lot of force to press. I don't have a way to measure that, but these are, I would say, lighter to press than the buttons on a typical Anbernic or on the Odin 2. Now, in terms of other stuff on here, on the controller, you have power in. This is only for power, so you can't transfer files over this. You can't display video. If you want to do either one of those things, you need to take the controller off and use the port on the handheld itself. There's a micro SD slot right here. You can put in a micro SD card. Here's your headphone jack, and that's pretty much it. There's some spaces on here so the sound can get out when you have the controller attached, and that's actually about it. I mean, for what you're getting, if you're getting the closer to $200 price, I think the quality of this, in terms of how it's put together and how the controls feel, how it feels in the hand, is really good. And let's actually talk about the controls a little bit. So let's take a look at the controls on the Razer Edge, at least the default controller that it comes with. You could actually change this out if you wanted to. There's nothing preventing you from using a different brand controller on this, because it's basically, as long as it will fit the device, it will work. But let's do the default controls. Now, I will go ahead and admit I am not a big fighting game fan, but a lot of people seem to think this sort of thing is important. So let's take a look at Street Fighter. Now, like I said, I'm terrible at fighting games, so if I can pull off combos at all, then I consider it a win. But when playing platformers, the D-pad control works pretty well. This is a clicky D-pad. It's a little bit reminiscent of the joystick that you find in a handheld like the Neo Geo Pocket Color. So, for playing platformers on the PlayStation 1 that rely on the D-pad, I found this to work pretty well. So I just unplugged the sound output here. But you can actually hear, maybe, that's holding it right up to the mic. So you can hear that there's some clickiness in there. There's also clickiness in the buttons, which again, that's holding it right up to the mic. So it is probably a bit more, it's actually a lot louder probably in the microphone than it would be in real life. So you do get some clickiness. There's micro switches here for the buttons. You get the tactile feedback. The shoulders are somewhat clicky, and of course you've got smooth analog triggers. Now, speaking of analog, we have the joysticks here. The joysticks are basically the size of switch sticks here, but you can actually get some fine control here. Some of the, a lot of the Chinese retro handhelds, basically the joystick functions almost like a digital joystick. But you actually can get some fine motion here, and this is particularly good for playing space sims, which is one of my favorite genres. And I find that playing on this, I can fly a good deal more accurately than using, say, the RG556 without the joystick fix, probably even with the joystick fix, and the Odin 2 and handhelds like that. So the joysticks, there is a little bit of natural pull towards the four directions here, but if you compare this to your typical Anbernic, and in fact most of the other Chinese handhelds with built-in controls that I've tested, these actually perform a good bit better if you're interested in fine analog control. So in terms of the buttons are pretty responsive, easy to press. I think I've mentioned that already. And I like the D-pad for at least platformers on the PlayStation. Been playing Gex with this thing, works fine. But Controls, I would say that probably due to this controller right here, which is a pretty good controller, the Edge has a leg up on a lot of the emulation handhelds because the controls are actually really good.
Welcome. Thank you very much. Ha! All right.
We need assistance over there.
Okay. All right.
Fight any way you like.
Woohoo! All right.
We need assistance over there. We need assistance over there.
Understood.
All right.
Stay down. Here we go.
So let's talk about some good and bad points with the Razer Edge, at least in my observations having owned one of these for a little while now. So first, the good. Well, you have a pretty good amount of power here for this handheld. I think I mentioned it in the specifications, but in terms of emulation power, I'd say it's between the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro and the Odin 2, so significantly more powerful than the T820 Anbernics. And you can get pretty good PlayStation 2 emulation, which if you watch my channel, you know that's kind of my thing. You can get pretty good PlayStation emulation and PlayStation 2 out of this. And you can run most PlayStation 2 games upscaled, full frame rate, and 2 to 3x for most games. Here up here actually is Star Ocean running at 3x, but you can get most of these games to run at full frame rate. You will have problems with some of the more difficult to run games, like for example Jak 3. You're going to have to lower your upscaling a bit. I mean, you could run it at 2x without too much difficulty. Things like Champions of Norath, you're going to have a bad time when you get into the Black Delve lava fields. But then again, you don't fare much better on the Odin 2 with that. Now, the Odin 2 will certainly emulate better than this. It is significantly more powerful, but this will actually do pretty well for most PlayStation 2 games. And it will do a good bit better than the only other reasonably priced OLED alternative, which is the RG556. Now, of course, a good point is the high quality screen. This is one of the best screens in terms of picture quality, refresh rate. Well, it probably is the best screen you can get on a handheld between $200 and $250. But this is actually a significantly better screen than you get on the Odin 2. Now, I don't have an Odin 2 Mini yet, so I can't compare it to that, but this is a far more visually appealing screen than the Odin 2, or than the 556. I think the 556, the colors are a little out of whack compared to this. I think the Razer Edge has the, for lack of a better word, edge in terms of color accuracy over the RG556. It also has a higher refresh rate, and you won't see ghosting or a lot of other visual artifacts on this screen that you would see on some of the other retro handhelds. So a really high point is the quality of the screen. It really is very good. And sound quality is pretty good for a tablet. The THX spatial sound sounds good. You're going to miss out on some bass, but I would put this on the higher side of sound quality from these emulation handhelds. So this is one of the better ones. Now, of course, controls. The controls are responsive. The buttons feel really good. Now, of course, buttons are a personal preference thing, but they're easy to press. They have tactile feedback. And the analog sticks actually act like analog sticks, unlike some offerings from Anbernic and some of the other companies out there where the sticks are serviceable, but they act more like 8-way digital joysticks than analog sticks. And if you're a space simulator fan like me, you'll probably appreciate the quality of the analog sticks. Now, one thing that isn't brought up a lot, but this is actually a Play Protect certified handheld, which means that you probably won't have trouble installing stuff off the Play Store, like weird incompatibilities and things like that. Also, it's got a full Android install, so things work. Like, for example, I can actually use, you may have seen it on my screen, you may have seen a radar app there, and the location, even though this doesn't have a GPS, the location services are actually functional. So a lot of the retro handhelds kind of skimp out on the Android installation. They have weird issues if you're trying to run certain things off the App Store. The Razer Edge is probably not going to have those problems. You're not going to be playing Pokemon Go on this because there's no GPS, but pretty much everything else works, and it's not a big hassle getting stuff installed. Now, one thing that I kind of mentioned, you might say, well, this thing is huge. It can't be pocketable. But if you just take the controller off, you can slip it into this little thing right here, which is just a sleeve I have from one of my PlayStation Vitas. Slip it in your pocket, no problem. Also, because it is something you can take apart, you can actually put it in a small case. For reference, this is the case for my Retroid Pocket 3, which is similar in size to a Retroid Pocket 4. Notice that the case is This one's a little thicker, but other than that, it's about the same size. It's actually pretty comparable. It does add a little thickness here because it's actually molded to the handheld. And this case for my Pocket 3, it just actually sits in there, so it's not the best case. But comparing to something like an Odin 2, which out of the, all put together, they seem to be about the same size, but you can see that this case here is significantly smaller. So, this is surprisingly portable because you can take it apart. And it's really nice to be able to just slip this in a bag. This is actually a pretty portable device, even with the controller. Of course, without the controller, you can literally just slip it in a pocket. So it is more portable than you would think, just looking at it like this, because you can take it apart. You can either not take the controller or just store it in a relatively small case, and you're good to go. So it's actually pretty darn portable. Now, in my testing, running PlayStation 2 games that are pretty demanding at high upscale settings and full frame rate, it's getting around 5 hours of playtime here. Of course, you can back down on the settings, get more playtimes. You can lower the screen. This actually does have adaptive brightness. So I was just running it with adaptive brightness on with a relatively light room. So I think the actual screen brightness was around 70-ish% when I was testing this out. So you can get decent battery life playing PlayStation 2 out of this. It is not as good as the Odin 2's battery life, but it will get you a lot of gaming. So the Odin 2 certainly bests this in battery life. But this is pretty good. Now, the other thing that's actually a pro is if you don't like this controller for whatever reason, I do, you can always just replace it with another one. This will work with pretty much any Android phone controllers. So if you're not really a fan of Razer's Kishi V2 Pro, then you can swap it out. Or if something goes bad here, you don't have to toss the whole handheld. You can just slap another controller on it. You're good to go. Now, there are bad things about this handheld. Of course, the elephant in the room for some retro gamers is the 20:9 aspect ratio. Now, what that means is, even though this screen is huge, I've got it displaying 16:9 right now, so you can actually see that it is not too bad. But just for a point of reference, I have an Anbernic RG556, and apparently I had it off, so I have to wait for it to boot up. But one thing I noticed is the viewable display on this is actually a little larger than the RG556. So let me get some kind of something going on here. There we go. That's good enough. So you can actually see them sitting right next to each other. They are very, very similar in viewable screen area for 16:9 and 4:3 content. So if you're actually satisfied with the screen size on the RG556, this 5.5-inch 16:9 diagonal, then the Razer Edge is giving you pretty much the same screen space. Like I said, I measured it with a ruler. It's slightly larger for 16:9 content with the black bars on the Edge than the RG556. Very slightly larger. Now, if you're playing 4:3 content, you get what's equivalent to about a 4 5/8 inch diagonal measurement screen, which, this is probably not as good for 4:3 content as maybe some other choices, but most of the high-end choices actually have at least a 16:9 screen. So the Odin, you're going to get a bigger screen for 16:9 and 4:3 content than this, obviously. But the trade-off with the Odin is you're back to IPS with ghosting and oversaturated colors and all that other not so good stuff. So yes, one issue is certainly the aspect ratio. But like I said, here is 16:9 content. It looks fine. You could actually stretch this out. In stretching this out, Fate and Sophia will gain a little bit of weight, but it's actually not that bad. If you don't mind stretched out content, in other contexts, it's fine here. It's close enough. But if you want to play 16:9, the black bars are actually black, which is nice. Now, another issue that I've noticed with this is if you leave this just in sleep mode and you leave the controller attached, the controller will draw power while the handheld is sleeping, which means that you will get less standby time if you leave the controller attached. Now, there's two things you can do to avoid that. One thing is you can just take the controller off, which if you're putting it in a case like this, you're probably going to do that anyway because the controller goes here and the handheld goes up here. So if you're storing this in a travel case, it's not going to be an issue. If you store it with the controller off of it, it's not an issue. But if you store it like this in sleep mode, this will lose more battery power than it ought to. So kind of a design flaw there. Now, one other thing I should mention here that I've noticed, I'm not sure if it's my particular micro SD card because I don't have a whole bunch of spares to try it with, but I did notice that some PlayStation 2 games, didn't notice it on PSP or on PlayStation 1, but there are some PS2 games where you would get some occasional stuttering if the game is on the micro SD card. So that suggests that the micro SD card's not being read as fast as maybe it could be, or maybe it's just my micro SD card. But I did notice a little bit of stuttering for some games, not all of them, when the games were stored on the micro SD card. Now, the solution to that is just copy them to the internal storage. I see no stuttering whatsoever on the internal storage. So something to think about. And not everybody apparently has seen this issue. I have, and the solution is copy the games. If they're a game that gives you a little stuttering problem, copy them to the internal storage. So, also, fan noise. This thing has a fan. In particular, the first day or two you own it, it will basically never stop running. I think because Android is installing stuff in the background, it settles down after a little while. But it is a thing, when you get this thing up and running, I don't see it thermally throttling all that much, but the fan will run and you will hear it. So there is fan noise with this thing. This is a louder fan than you would see in the RG556, unless the 556 is running full blast. And it's certainly a louder fan than I've noticed in the Odin. But, there will be some fan noise. Most of the time when I'm just playing a PlayStation 2 game, it's not that big of a deal. The funny thing is, Android games seem to spin the fan up more than PlayStation 2 emulation does. But be aware that, yes, there is a fan, and if you're not aware that there's a fan, you will probably know it within a couple hours of getting Android set up. So, we have some good points, some bad points, some potential issues. Let's talk about, is this kind of worth a buy? So we've looked at the Edge. We've seen a little bit of gameplay. We talked about the controls, the build quality, good points, bad points, potential issues you might have, potential things that are very much to like about this device. So, of course, the elephant in the room is pricing. At $400, do not buy this. This is absurd. It should have never been released at $400 with the specifications it has because, of course it wasn't going to sell. There's other stuff you could buy that would certainly be more competitive. But now that you can get these at a discount between $200 and $250, I have to say I'm enjoying this. I'm carrying this around a lot. The main thing is I'm getting old. I want a big clear screen. I want good display quality. And this is a way to get good display quality without completely breaking the bank, particularly if you are able to get that Newegg deal with the coupon code. It's like $199.99 delivered. That's pretty hard to beat. for a handheld that's at least this quality. Now, of course, there are things to not like as well. We talked about the aspect ratio being a more phone-like aspect ratio. Of course, the fact that you can take it apart is both a good and a bad thing. You can make it more portable, but there are more things with this handheld as opposed to just grabbing your RG556 or your Odin 2 and it's all in one piece. But there's also the controls. The controls are really good on this. I don't think people, if they buy this, are going to be, oh, the controls are terrible. It's got a decent quality D-pad. I mean, if you like the micro switch style buttons here, they're excellent. So, there's a lot of good stuff about this. Is it the handheld for you? Well, if you're looking for something, quote, pocketable with its controls, well, probably not, because with the controls on it, it's pretty big. With the controls off, it is very slim. And even comparing it to something like what a lot of people consider a very pocketable handheld, this RG505, if you take the controls off, it's actually thinner and only a little bit larger, except for the largeness is almost entirely the screen. Of course, you have to play with touch controls if you don't take the controller with you, but it is an option that you don't get with a lot of other handhelds, and particularly if you want to keep your PlayStation 2 emulation or whatnot away from your phone, or if you're like me, you have an iPhone and you can't emulate PlayStation 2 on it anyway. This is certainly a nice choice. Let's put the controller back on. See, it's actually pretty easy to take the controller off and put it on. Now, again, whether or not you like this device is kind of personal preference, but it does have a good amount of power for emulating certainly classic Sony devices. And I haven't tried Switch on this. I think if it can run in 6 gigs of RAM, that it'll probably run fine. But this probably doesn't have the kind of memory you'd want to run a lot of Switch games or Win Later or things like that. But if you're looking for PlayStation 2, GameCube, probably 3DS, systems like that, then this is going to certainly have enough power to handle that. So, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you like the video, please remember to leave a like. If you want to see more content on the channel, remember to hit subscribe, and if you have any questions or comments, the comment section is always open. Thanks for watching, and see you next video.